Well, welcome. I think we'll begin. Thank you for coming this evening. I know it's a busy day. There's a lot going on here in Gossel, so I'm glad you could all make it. This evening we are going to hear from Arlin Bowler, and his interest in Anabaptism started by an impromptu or surprise unplanned visit to the Wartburg Castle in Eisenach, Germany. He got off the bus and walked into the Reformation story, and this was in 1980, not 18. So we will welcome Arlin Bowler to share his presentation on Roots and Fruits.
Thank you. The lights up here that are just about to blind me, and off my bald head, they're having a problem.
Take thou my hand, O Father, and lead thou me until my journey endeth eternally. Alone I will not wander one single day. Be thou my true companion, and with me stay.
Christ is the center of our identity. Our Anabaptist theology is radically Christ-centered. If Jesus overrules the Old Testament, one has to reject violence. And the Christ-centered faith is the foundation of our Mennonite identity, as written by Paul Schrog in Mennonite World Review in June of 2000. We know the story. Let's just connect the dots. Yeah, that contains facts, it contains trivia, it's stories and legends. And the thing about a legend is, Babe Ruth was a legend. He really lived. But not all the stories about Babe Ruth are true. So, our people are seeking truth and faith. It happened over many, many centuries. The Waldensians in Lyon, France, under the leadership of Peter Waldo in the 1100s, were seeking truth and faith. Wycliffe, again, seeking truth and faith. Jan Hus in Prague, Czechoslovakia, in the 1300s and the 1400s, seeking truth and faith, and Hus was burned at the stake. Faith. Where do you place your trust? convictions. What will you always do and what will you never do? So we put ourselves on a timeline in Anabaptist faith. Our faith is what is our root. "500 years of believers' faith." We date back to the Radical Reformation. 150 years of Mennonite witness in Kansas, Central Plains of North America. That timeline is a very scholarly work, and I have a copy of it on the charts over here. But that was done by Robert Kreider and one of his associates. It is a very, very scholarly work, and I highly recommend looking at it. I added some things on my chart. You see some red stars came up over there. One of those, the first one, is Prussia to Russia from Shakovka. The second one is Russia to U.S. And the last one on the upper border is Mennonite Church USA. So what is a religious denomination? It is not a key to heaven. A denomination is a structure through which you worship and serve. The Mennonite churches of Central Kansas, Central North America, we are most abundantly blessed. But how did we get to 1874? That's what has caused us to gather. From Switzerland, Holland, Germany, Prussia, Poland, Russia, Ukraine, America, to Africa, Asia, India, Middle East. This is no longer a Northern Europe phenomena. So we've got this chart. It's a blizzard of color. Unless you know what you're looking for, you don't understand any part of it. So how did we get to 1874? If you look at the bottom, there's a color code. Cultural, political, American history, Mennonite witness, faith. The pink is cultural, the blue is political, the yellow is American history, the tan is Mennonite witness, and the green is faith-related. Now when you look at this, if you see the colors, there's a rhyme to that and a reason to what you see. Believers faced with born in a struggle, in a political, cultural, and religious renaissance. And what shaped that renaissance or that renewal? Beginning in 1450, the printing press enables the distribution of information. In today's world, it's the internet and the computer. The printing press enables the distribution of information. Columbus sails towards the edge of the world. In today's world, that's the exploration of space and visiting solar planets. The printing press enables the distribution. Columbus sails. Michelangelo is painting the Sistine Chapel. You know, why is this Michelangelo and the Sistine Chapel important? Because it's an expression of faith. Martin Luther is reading and translating the Bible. And the printing press is coming into its own. The printing press enabled the whole thing with the distribution of learning. The internet and the computer are major tools for information storage, information distribution, for teaching, and for learning. None of you people go anywhere without checking the computer or the telephone or something. So Columbus sails to the edge of the world. Where is that? It's just off the coast of Florida. So in 1492, Columbus sailed. In 1517, Martin Luther tacked his theses on the wall. In 1525, Mons, Blaurock, and Grabel baptized each other. And they were in conflict with Zwingli in Zurich concerning church and state. Michelangelo's ceiling. I never realized the significance of artwork and icons in worship. The Sistine Chapel paintings are a testimony to faith, God, and church. In a mostly illiterate society, the pictures illustrated the glory of God. The people who came to worship were, for the most part, illiterate. Pictures reminded them of the stories of their faith. And Martin Luther was in the Wartburg Castle in protective custody. His church officials wanted to do away with him because he was causing problems. And so the Duke kept him in protective custody in the Wartburg Castle. This is 4 years before 1525 and the beginning of the Anabaptist Reformation in Zurich. This is the world in which our Anabaptist Reformation forefathers were living, working, and growing. This is what shaped Blaurock, Grabel, Mons, their thinking. So the question remains, how did we get to 1874? We were privileged to sing the Luther hymn, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God," in the tower of the Wartburg Castle. Now it's interesting, the Wartburg Castle is on the mountaintop. There's no moat, but there is a drawbridge. That's what "A Mighty Fortress is Our God" looked like, published during Martin Luther's life. That's what his publication looked like. And then the name Fritz Erb shows up at the Wartburg Castle. Now that sounds really familiar. And there's a plaque on the tower that says, Fritz Erb died here after being imprisoned for 8 years for being an Anabaptist. So after Luther was imprisoned there, Fritz Erb was imprisoned there, both of them for their faith. Switzerland, St. Peter's Abbey in the Black Forest. Sattler was a monk at the abbey. Michael Sattler died in 1527. Sattler authored the Schleitheim Confession. This is a defining document in the Radical Reformation or the Anabaptist Reformation. Menno Simons, born in 1496, in Whitmarsen, Friesland, served as a priest at Pinjum, Friesland. And this is a church where he was a priest. 1525, the Anabaptist movement begins. Anabaptist is a Greek word defined as another baptism. This was considered heresy by the established church and the civil authorities. The Stadtkirche, or the Landeskirche, that's religious nationalism. The origin of this practice is rooted in the Holy Roman Empire. Martin Luther demanded that each secular territorial landlord or monarch should exercise episcopal functions. That meant that the church and state were in full cooperation and maintained control of their people. The Anabaptists were hated by both Protestants and Catholics. These radical reformers wanted to not merely reform the church, but restore it. And that's according to the magazine Christianity Today. Ulrich Zwingli, the name that we all have heard many times, he was very, very insistent that the state church was important. He refused to break with the provincial lords and the civil authorities. The radical reformers, the Anabaptists, were hated by the followers of Zwingli and the city and the provincial lords, and of course the Stadtkirche, or the state church. So where did the Anabaptists go? They had to hide because they were being hunted. This is a hiding place in a hayloft in Switzerland, and that is the overhang of the hayloft that man is in, and that was a hiding place where they could get through a trapdoor and into the soffit of the barn, and that was a hiding place in a hayloft. The secret church, or the secret gathering places, the hidden churches. Peter Peters made his boat available for teaching and for worship. When they looked for secret places to worship, they went for a walk in the woods. And maybe they would pass a word on to their neighbors and say, hey, we're going to gather at such and such a time in such and such a valley or in such and such a place in the hills. So they would go for a walk in the woods in order to gather and worship and study. One of the places they gathered were in caves. There are some caves in Switzerland, and this is the mouth of one of them. And it was known as the Taufrahuli, or Anabaptist Cave. We had the privilege of observing and celebrating the Lord's Supper in that cave. We need to do a short review. Where are we in our story? 1492, Columbus. 1517, Martin Luther tacked his 95 topics of discussion on the church door. The church door was the place where everybody in town went. It was kind of like putting your poster in the grocery store window. Because everybody goes to the grocery store. Not everybody goes to church anymore. But at that point, everybody went to church, and so the best bulletin board in town was the church door, and that's where Martin Luther posted his topics for discussion. And believers' baptism, Felix Mons, George Blaurock, and Conrad Grable were the Anabaptist believers leading Bible studies and teaching believers' faith. That was in 1525. So hopefully this timeline starts to take on some form of meaning. The early 1500s defined our forefathers' faith. Believers' baptism was a defining act. We are not regenerated because we have been baptized, but we are baptized because we have been regenerated by faith and the Word of God. Regeneration is not the result of baptism, but baptism is the result of regeneration. This can indeed not be controverted by any man or disproven by the Scriptures. Menno Simons, an Anabaptist leader. Believers' baptism resulted in the separation of church and state. And if you look at the left part of that timeline, there are multiple colors implied on in those blocks, because much of it's political, some of it's faith, much of it is cultural also. Believers' baptism resulted in the separation of church and state. Separation of church and state has its origin in the free church. The Stadtkirche, or the state church, controlled or had infant baptism, enabled the political leaders to record census and control taxation. Mons, the illegitimate son of cathedral clergy, lived with his mother on this street in Zurich, Switzerland. In Zurich, Switzerland, in the home of Felix Mons and his mother, on Wednesday, January 21, 1525, Mons, Conrad Grable, and George Blaurock baptized each other into the believers' baptism faith community. Grable baptized Blaurock, and Blaurock baptized the others. In Zollikon, Switzerland, in the home of Rudy Thoman, the Anabaptists continued to defy the state church and the city council. They baptized 25 adult believers into the Believers Baptism Church. And the name George Blaurock, George Kayakob, George of the house of Jacob. George Blaurock because he wore a blue coat. But George from the house of Jacob. Another name that you people may be familiar with is Ludwig von Beethoven. You know what the von is? It's not his middle name. He is Louis from the home of Beethoven. Ludwig von Beethoven is basically Louis from the home of Beethoven. Blaurock was chained to this rock for baptizing believers who worshiped a risen Lord. George Blaurock was held in Sommersburg Castle in Gufidon, Tyrol. Blaurock was burned at the stake and martyred on September 6, 1529. Balthasar Hubemeyer, an Anabaptist evangelist, was burned at the stake on March 10, 1526. 3 days later, his wife was drowned in the Danube River. The Anabaptist immigrations to Prussia started in the early 1500s. There was a certain amount of abuse, and there was a relief. There was a hope for relief, and some of the dukes in what we now know as Prussia, Poland, were inviting some of these people who were troubled in northern Germany and in Holland. Prussian royalty welcomed the Dutch immigrants. You know, the Dutch, they were in Holland where they were used to farming in swampy land and draining it. So the Prussian dukes put them in the Vistula River Valley where there was a swamp that needed to be drained. So these Dutch immigrants going to Prussia, hey, they had skills that the Prussian dukes needed. In 1660, Martyrs' Mirrors published in Holland. This is the story of 17 centuries of Christian martyrdom, from the time of Christ to 1600 AD. It was first published in Dutch in Holland in 1660. It's illustrated by a Dutch artist, Jan Luyken, in 1685. That's only a couple of years later. The German translation was done by U.S. Anabaptists in 1748. So the German translation didn't happen in Europe, it happened in Pennsylvania. The English translation was done in Pennsylvania in 1837. Now, if you look at that German translation by U.S. Anabaptists in 1748, that's just ahead of the Civil War. Revolutionary War. And there's a legend, you talk about legends, there is a legend, and it has a certain amount of credibility, that the troops used Martyr's Mirror as wadding in the cannons because they needed something to stick in there with the powder. And there is a cover page from a 1748 German printing in Ephrata, Pennsylvania. I think there's one of those within about 30 miles of here. I think I had the privilege of seeing it. I'm not talking about North Newton. I hope they have one too. But I talked to somebody that I think has one of these in their archives. Jan Luyken illustrated the 1685 edition of Martyr's Mirror with 104 copper etchings. 31 of these plates survive. Some are included in the Mirror of the Martyrs exhibit at Bethel College. Now, these etchings, which were done in 1685, were collector's items in the art market for many, many years. As a result of World War II and some of the other battles, when people were ordered to turn in all precious metals and the like, there were art dealers who refused to give up the copper etchings and hid them instead. Amos Hoover in Pennsylvania discovered that some of these copper plates were still in existence in the 1970s. He went to Germany to an art dealer, and found 30 plus of them. Whether the rest of them are still stuck in some attic or hidden someplace as a result of World War II, we don't know. Amos Hoover wasn't able to figure out. Robert Kreider wasn't able to figure out. But between Amos Hoover, Robert Kreider, and Jan Gleistein, they were able to negotiate with the art collectors to get approximately 31 of these etchings and get them into the holdings of the Mennonite archives. And that's a picture that many of you people are very, very familiar with. 1683, the first Mennonite settlements came to America in Germantown, Pennsylvania. The group included Dutch Mennonites and German Quakers. The Swiss Dutch, German, Prussian, Russian, North American Anabaptist story unfolds. Szykówka and Konopat are 60 miles south of Gdansk or Danzig, Poland, depending on which pronunciation or town you were familiar with. That's where our ancestors were, in Szykówka. This is a picture that Rod Rascliffe took a couple of years ago of the graveyard in Szykówka. The church in Szykówka and Konopat villages was also known as the Weedle Church. Reverend Peter Weedle was a spiritual leader. 2 generations of Weedles had served as elders. The Reverend Peter Weedle was 28 years old in 1820 when they immigrated to Russia. Reverend Peter Weedle died in 1871, just 3 years before our ancestors came to the United States. He was the longest serving elder of the Szykówka/Alexandroville congregations. And this is information supplied by Mrs. Isaac Fast and Maria Becker. This is a picture that Mark Jansen took about a year ago of the same graveyard. Now, let's keep in mind, this graveyard's 200 years since our ancestors were there. So I'm not sure exactly what all we're looking at. This is a picture from about a week ago, or maybe it's May 18th. 2 weeks ago, that Dave and Judy Regier were given. This is restoration work that's being done in Szykówka right now. Catherine lived in a castle. That's the Hermitage. And if you ever have an opportunity to visit the Hermitage, it is a treat. It is one of the most wonderful art museums in the world. In 1798, a Prussian Mennonite group in preparation to go to Russia sent 2 elders to St. Petersburg to secure an official paper in regard to the immigration status in Russia. They waited 2 years in St. Petersburg for the document. See, immigration wasn't just pick up and go. They had to have permission to leave. They had to have permission to enter. Hey, governments are still that way. They were that way then and they are now. They waited 2 years for their immigration papers to go from Prussia to Russia. When they did get them, they came from Tsar Paul. This is the home of Tsar Paul. So, the immigration from Prussia to Russia. That's basically the map of where they went. Volhynia was about halfway between Prussia and Molochna. The immigrations from Prussia began in the 1780s. The ancestors that we are referring to left Shakovka actually in 1821. No, they left in 1820 and arrived in Ukraine in 1821. That's the way it was. The 890-mile trip was completed with wagons and carts. On this trip, they met another wagon train, that of Alexander. Tsar Alexander wished them well or woe. Several of the villages in Molochna are named in honor of this travel encounter with Russian royalty. You thought you were going to get by without an assignment. I'm a school teacher. Homework. Look up pages 23, 24, and 25 in They Seek a Country, David Wiebe, and you will gain an insight into the immigration frustrations, the difficulties that those people encountered. Definition of synonyms. Tsar, spelled several ways. King, emperor, Caesar, Kaiser, Sultan. It's all the same thing. Tsarina, spelled two ways. Queen, empress. Again, it's royalty. So, the Russian map. The Groningen and Old Flemish Society of Mennonites in Poland, Prussia, and Russia. Okay, we had several different groups that came out of Holland. The Groningen, the Flemish. I can't go into detail about exactly what their identifying ideology was, but we were subgrouped. Went to Shakovka, Konopat, Volhynia, Kortitz, the Molochna, Bergethal, and the Volga. That's off the map here. And of course, we're particularly addressing Alexanderville tonight. The Groningen, that was northern Holland. The Old Flemish, that was southern Holland. Those societies were formed in the Netherlands as they split from their Flemish congregations in 1628. So the Ukrainian map. Kortitz is in Zaporozhye. You've heard about Zaporozhye in the daily news, about Ukrainian war. Hauptstadt, or Tokmak, that's in the area of the Molochna. Volhynia, again, is up in the western part of Ukraine. Bergethal. And here we have the Crimea. There was also much frustration between the optimistic reports of opportunity before engaging in the immigration and the hardships of extended travel encountered in the process and the broken promises at arrival. There were many frustrations. These were captured in a Low German folk rhyme: begged, given, borrowed, and taken, destitute, sick, hungry, and forsaken. Thus father and mother fled from Prussia to the wild steppes of South Russia. For those of you that didn't understand me, I just said I can't say it in Low German. Fern was smiling back there. She understood every word. The Molochna River Valley, that's where they were invited to settle. "57 villages. The area 40 miles by 20 miles. And that's what it looks like from a satellite. With Alexandroville being here, Some of you people know Landeskron, and of course the villages in between are along the river. From here to here is just over 4 miles. These people were all part of the Alexandrovo church in the 1870s. Churchyard, the church was right up there next to the street. The cemetery is down away underneath the picture. I am not aware of any grave markers in that cemetery. Yes, I was next to a threshing stone in Ukraine. And that is a sign at the entrance to the village of what we know as Alexandrovo. It had 2 different names when we were there. I think one was Ukrainian and one was Russian. That's the Alexandrovo Church in the Malach in the 1860s. In 1990-91, when I was there, this is the structure that I saw. Now, it wasn't until I was back when an architect from Canada told me, examine the brickwork around the windows. If you examine the brickwork around the windows, you know that it's the same building. I have to say, when I was standing in front of that building, I did not know I was standing in front of the Alexandrovo Church. I did not recognize it. Johann Cornies was born in 1879 in Schönbaum, Danzig, Prussia. He was 31 years old when they immigrated to Ukraine. Johann Cornies was an influential community leader. He became the agricultural representative of all Mennonites in Russia. He worked with the government. He was the liaison. Johann Cornies was an innovative and progressive community and agricultural leader. The accepted educational philosophy: agriculture is more important than education. Only basic academic skills are needed. That philosophy wasn't only prevalent then, it's been prevalent after that too. Johann Cornies instituted erection of model schoolhouses, compulsory school attendance, uniform textbooks and prescribed courses of study, teachers training schools, the licensing of teachers. Those were all innovations of Johann Cornies. Well, we're making our way across to 1874. During the years in Russia, our forefathers found and created many tests of fellowship, some of which we have validated and some we have failed to adopt. The bread breakers, and this is as a result of Rich Preheim's research. The bread breakers, they broke bread as Christ did and did not slice bread. And that was 7 days a week, 3 meals a day, no knife on bread. You only broke the bread. And that was a test of fellowship. As I said, Rich Preheim, Mountain Mennonite World Review, 2016. In 1860 in Iowa, a desire to empower Anabaptist Mennonite congregations resulted in the formation of General Conference Mennonite Church. In the 1860s, John Holdeman, an Anabaptist Mennonite evangelist, ministered to his community in eastern Ohio. This became the Church of God in Christ Mennonite. 1860, an Anabaptist renewal movement in Russia resulted in the Mennonite Brethren Church being organized and established. And in 1869, the Crimmer Mennonite Brethren Church is established. Now, it was interesting for me to note how much interaction there was between our forefathers in the 1860s and 1870s, even though there was a divisive movement also. For example, David Wiebe, very important leader in the Crimmer Mennonite Brethren Church, was married by one of the elders from the Alexandroville church, which crossed that divide. The clergy interacted. Mennonites in Russia experienced unrest, 1870. The threat of Russification of social, business, educational programs is advocated by the Tsar. Mandatory military conscription and military service is implemented. The commitment to immigrate came about as a result of 12 delegates investigating immigration opportunities in 1873. The delegates visited the central plains of North America and from Kansas to Manitoba. They recommended immigration. The Alexandroville group was represented by Elder Jacob Buller, and they initially decided to go to Nebraska. So now we got a plan. It is so reassuring when you know what you're going to do. And then you get clarification. Boy, and that helps. The 12 spies or delegates that brought a message of hope. Boy, we were happy. Now a message from the Tsar, and now we got a frown. The Tsar sent Edward Tobelbaum to the colonies in May of 1874. His message from Tsar Alexander II was to offer concessions and to discourage the anticipated immigration. Okay, a few details. Oh, pardon, I didn't mean to move on. The Asian immigration story is not part of this. That happened after 1880. So that those of you that know about the Asian immigrations, which included Klaus Epp as well as numerous others later in the 1800s, all happened after 1874. The railroads needed immigrants. The land agents were in competition with each other. The Marion County Mennonite immigration story includes Burlington and Quincy Railroad land agents and the Nebraska and Santa Fe Railroad land agents. Hey, they were businessmen. This was a business transaction. Immigration happens if there's push and pull. Push was a Russification of business, social, educational structures, and military conscription. Pull was economic opportunity, hope for abundant, fertile farmland. Prussia to Russia immigration was enticed by exemption from military conscription, living in their own cultural world, German language use in school and fellowship. These were some of the provisions granted to immigrants to Russia beginning in 1780. There were no religious guarantees or exemption from military conscription in 1874 in their immigration to the United States. And this is according to They Seek a Country, David Wiebe, page 25. However, in Russia, an amendment to the Russia militia law of 1868 allowed a person exemption from military duty if they annually filed an affidavit with the county clerk to affirm their religious affiliation and objection to war. That's D.C. Wadle's book, The Story of Alexandroville. And in 1871, the Moluchna Mennonites refused alternative service hospital work, according to D.C. Wadle. Those of you that have been classified 1W will find that rather interesting. Number one, immigrations began in the early 1870s. In 1874, a surge of immigrations from Russia is prompted by railroad agents. And number three, immigrants Germans from Russia, including Catholics, Jews, Lutheran, Baptists, Mennonite farmers. The railroad agents weren't looking for any particular faith. They wanted buyers. In 1877, Nicodemus is established as an African American settlement. The Homestead Act of 1862 and the slavery ending in 1865 all provided for settlement possibilities for the black community of Nicodemus. In 1878, that's 4 years after 1874, the last Indian battle, the U.S. Army battles indigenous natives in Scott County, Kansas. I lived in Scott City for 3 years. The Indian chiefs were attempting to humanely care for their people. That's all they wanted, was to take care of their tribe. But the American government wanted to keep them on their reservation. The Quakers and the River Brothers established a settlement near Sterling in 1870s. The Swedish Lutherans established a settlement in 1869 in Lindsborg, became known as Little Sweden, USA. Pilsen, the Catholic community in northern Marion County, was established in 1874. In Ellis County, Victoria, a British colony, arrived in 1876. Early 1870s, Mennonites from eastern United States, Pennsylvania in particular, settled in Kansas. The Spring Valley Mennonite Church and the Brunk settlement between Marion Center and Hillsborough arrived in the early 1870s. And some of you may have heard about the plow furrow across the prairie so that people wouldn't get lost between their villages. And yes, Marion used to be called Marion Center. Ukrainian Russia was a home for several ethnic and religious groups. The faith represented in Germans from Russia is an evidence of that diversity. We're now on page 2 of our timeline. And you see the color codes and the different colors and the blending of colors for the different events that happened there. So, we're notably aware of two ships, the Cimbria and the Teutonia. It's very interesting to note the Cimbria was built for 58 first-class passengers, 120 second-class passengers, and steerage, which is in the cargo bay, 500. That totals 678. If you check the immigration books over here that I have one page of, you can see what it was like for them to keep records when the people got off the ships. But when our ancestors docked at Castle Gardens, 985 people got off. The ship was built for 678. On the Teutonia, it was built for 50 first class, 135 second class, 310 steerage. That totals 495. 1,008 people got off. The immigration ships were very overloaded, similar to what we hear about in the Mediterranean or the Caribbean Sea. The other thing about the Cimbria, it was 7 years old at this point. It was considered a luxury liner. It was one of the finest ships on the waters. But our people, for the most part, were in steerage. Steerage was temporary housing. So, 1,300 miles by train to northern Germany. To get from Molochna, Crimea, to Hamburg, 1,300 miles a week by train. And then approximately 16 days from Hamburg across to New York. And then we had another 1,200 miles or more, and probably another week by train to Nebraska. where they faced another decision-making process. Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas. The railroad agents were attempting to lure them. This is a partial list from David Weeby's book, They Seek a Country, of the ships that arrived in May of 73, August of 73. There were a lot of Gnadenau people on that one. July of 74, these went to Canada. August of 74, City of Chester, City of Richmond, they had Volhynia people on it, Volhynia Swiss. I understand many of the Eden Mennonite people were on those ships. Simbering, Teutonia, Malachna, Low German, Alexanderville, Hoffnungsau. I know there were more Gnadenau people on these two ships at this point. And also in August, the Nederland, the Vaderland, Abbotsford. That's only a partial list. In 72, there was one immigrant ship. In 73, there were 7. In 1874, there were 34 ships that came to America. 75, 16, 76, 18, and those numbers in the teens continued for many years. And the immigration continued, prompted by wars and other conflicts. So steerage. Steerage was the lower decks. Because immigrants were considered cargo. Steerage deck compartments also referred to as tween deck or Schweizendeck in German. The term steerage refers to deck where the controls, rudder, steam engines, and mechanical operations of the ship were contained. Steerage decks accommodations for passengers were built or torn out depending on the voyage and the cargo. These boxes, which served as bunks, would be torn out for the return trip from the Americas to Europe. The journey lasted several weeks or more after a week on the train. They wore the same clothes beginning before. They boarded the ship until they arrived at their destination. No privacy, very little sanitation. Minimum sleeping space recommendations were 18 inches of bunk width space. One of the governments, and I don't know which one in Europe it was, tried to enforce some kind of minimum standards for these immigrants that were being hauled in as cargo. Yeah. There was a mother that went on that train trip, went to Hamburg. Her baby boy was 6 months old. She and her husband and their family, they were going to head for, it was her firstborn, it was her first son. They were going to be going to Kansas. And they were on the train, and they went and got on the, I don't know which one of the ships it was. There was another lady, another family that made the trip. And they went by train to Hamburg. And as fate would have it, she delivered a little girl in Hamburg en route. So now you have a mother with a newborn and another mother with a 6-month-old. They get on the ship and they head out to sea. Well, the mother of the 6-month-old boy ceases to lactate. She loses her ability to feed her son. Well, here was a mother with a newborn little girl. Says, I'll take care of him. And so she fed 2 babies during that immigration trip across the ocean. Years later, this mother of this little girl tells the story that she nursed her daughter and her son-in-law, the two married. They're people of this church. Okay, got another homework assignment. You'll gain insight into the railroad and land agents and the luring and courting of the immigrants. So they arrived in Kansas. That's how the Mlutchen area fits into Kansas. We've got Bueller and Inman over here, Lehigh on that side, Marion, Walton. That's basically how it works out. Here's Newton. Area 40 miles, but 20 miles. And these are the villages that we had, that we established here in Marion County. 8 of them. And there comes Alexandroville, right into that area. Enabling circumstances. The railroads provided immigrant houses for temporary shelter. John Funk, Elkhart, Indiana, editor of Herald of Truth publication, solicited aid for the immigrants. Mennonites in the eastern United States aided immigrants that were traveling west. Entrepreneurial Mennonite immigrants enabled fellow immigrants with financial loans. Now, let's look at the roof lines here a little bit. We've got the Alexandroville Church in Russia and the Hufnungsau building. You see the resemblance there? Then you have the Alexandroville building of 1886 with a curved roof and the Hufnungsau building of 1898, again, with a curved roof. There are some architectural similarities. The modified hip roof is a Johann Cornies-inspired design. And note the 2 windows in the gable. When I was in Ukraine, they would point to it. That's a Mennonite building. They can tell by the 2 windows in the gable. The Hufnungsau Church was referred to as the Geddert's Church because Dietrich Geddert was the elder. And the name Hufnungsau, this is here indeed a true meadow of hope. 1870s and 1890s, before Gospel was a city, the villages south of Lehigh were referred to as the Buller Colony. Marion Record newspaper used the name of Elder Jacob Buller as the identity of the new settlement. About the new town of Lehigh in the western portion of Marion County, which is now going to be built up. The town site is beautifully located on the Marion and McPherson Railroad, about midway between Marion Center and McPherson City. Now, down here it said, it is just at the northern edge of what is known as the Buller Colony, one of the best and wealthiest colonies of Mennonites in the States. And remember, the name Gossel does not exist yet. In Russia, the word Alexandroville referred to the village, not the church. Both ships, the Cimbri and the Teutonia, could have docked between the driveways of the Alexandroville Church and between the church and the highway. And if you want to put a modern Caribbean cruise ship in there, it would reach from the road to somewhere in the field over there. It is many, many times the size of what our immigrant ships were. Reverend Peter Voth's long house has long been regarded as a model. It is about 80 feet long, if we can estimate correctly, and the floor plan is, this is the living space, This is the barn. There is a stove in the middle that heated the whole house, and they also used for cooking and baking and the like. And then there was what was known as the outside kitchen, or the buttigieg. Obviously, you wouldn't want to have all that heat in your house in the summertime, so you had a second kitchen outside that would keep all your cooking heat out of your living space. When I was in Uzbekistan, the footprint wasn't like this, but the same basic plan. The house was in the stove, everything was in the middle of the house, and then the rooms were built around it to be heated by it. Kind of interesting that this is the second house of worship built in 26 years. 1860 in Russia, 1886 in Kansas. These two structures have very similar dimensions. They're approximately 72 feet by 35 feet. This was in Russia, in Kansas. The footprint is very similar. The influence and inspiration of Johann Cornelius continues to give courage to Central United States immigrants. These Central U.S. immigrants are children and grandchildren of the people inspired by Johann Cornelius in Russia 50 years earlier. Kansas Mennonites demonstrated vision and commitment when they established the first Mennonite health care facility, Bethesda Hospital, and the first Mennonite institution of higher learning, Bethel College in North America. 1882, the Emmental School District. 1883, the Halstead Seminary. 1887, Bethel College is established. 1899, Bethesda Hospital is established. 1906, the Preparatory School is established. 1908, Tabor Mennonite Church is established. 1920, the Gospel Mennonite Church is established. 1920, Mennonite Central Committee meets the challenge of fostering love, mission, and generating opportunities to serve. I just went blank. Peggy at Tabor College Historical. What's her last name? Gertzen. Peggy Gertzen can tell the story very, very well of how MCC has its roots and its birth on the front porch of a house in Hillsboro. That's where MCC had its roots and its beginnings. In a group of citizens that got together, Mennonites that got together on a front porch on a summer evening. The stage projecting into the worship space and balconies on three sides is a Dutch or Holland characteristic. Note the reed organ and the grand piano on the stage. Now this picture was taken late, so that's when those had already been brought into the worship service and into the sanctuary. Now it's interesting to note that in Amsterdam, in the single kirk, balconies on three sides. 3 floors of balconies on 3 sides in Holland. This is the Alexandroville Church, balconies on 3 sides. This is in Karakhanda in Kazakhstan, balconies on 3 sides. This model or replica of the 1886 Alexandroville House of Worship is in the museum at Gossel. It is a very attractive model built by Alvin Gosen and really gives you an insight as to what the church looked like at that time. And for those of you that are not familiar, That structure was on this side of the arch to the Sunday school rooms over there on this side of the balcony. The outside wall. This was an outside wall, and there was an outside wall just on this side of that back balcony. 1928 was the time of remodeling. The three-point arch, which you see right in front of you over here, is kind of an icon. It's in the windows. It's in Memorial Hall at Bethel College. And it's in, oh, come on here. It's in Tashkent. I was sitting in the choir at Tashkent, in Uzbekistan, and looked back, and here is the arch. It's in Tashkent because in 1978, when the World Conference was in Wichita, there were 6 delegates that came to the World Conference from Russia, and they were taken on a tour of central Kansas. And one of the places they came was here. One of those church representatives from Russia took that idea back and incorporated it in their house of worship in Tashkent. A bell tower. This is not a hidden church. But notice, the broken arch or the three-point arch in the front. These logos represent agencies and the dedicated service offered to mission and the need in the name of Christ. Yes, Mennonite Disaster Service is up there. These logos represent some of the Anabaptist Church Conference organizations. And yes, Gossel had a city band, and many of you could find grandpas or uncles that are in that picture. World War I. Our parents and grandparents avoided the military conscription issue for approximately 40 years. Convictions. What will you always do? What will you never do? Camp Funston was a detention camp for conscience objectors at Fort Riley. It was the camp where the military organization attempted to change the convictions of conscientious objectors. Public media attacked the conscientious objector. This little pig stayed home. It's an object lesson. Public opinion, printed media, social pressures aggressively attacked the conscientious objector witness. Many conscientious objectors were abused and mistreated. Some who died in prison Some who died in prison in Leavenworth and Alcatraz were considered martyrs. In the Spring Valley Mennonite Church, local community masked militants came to the Reverend Charles Diener farm and stripped him and beat him and applied tar and feathers. The militants then went to Charles's father and stripped and beat and tarred and feathered Bishop D.A. Diener. A week later, the militants repeated the dastardly deed. They returned a third time and ransacked and looted and smeared yellow paint in the house. That's according to John Sharp, Mennonite World Review, 2014. And that's Charles Diener in front of the Spring Valley Church. John Schrag refused to purchase Liberty bonds to support the U.S. war effort. On November 11th, 1918, John Schrag from rural Burton, Kansas, was threatened with being lynched by the local community who supported the military war effort. Tom Roberts of the Anti-Horse Thief Association, he was deputized by the sheriff, placed John Schrag in protective custody and saved his life. There are accounts of the Ku Klux Klan activity in opposition to conscientious objectors. The newspapers in the area published the names of the activities of conscientious objectors. The names of conscientious objectors were posted on community bulletin boards. The names of those who failed or refused to purchase Liberty bonds were published and publicized as being unpatriotic and not supporting the U.S. war effort. The Red Cross organization was considered a paramilitary support organization. Some of the conscientious objector stories that we know. There are many. John Schrag, Burton, Daniel A. and Charles Diener, Canton, Walter and George Cooprider, Inman, Noah Leatherman, Mound Ridge, Cornelius Voth, Gossel, Ferdinand Schrader, Gossel, Albert C. Voth, Goldtree, Oklahoma, John Neufeld, Inman, Peter W. Pankratz, Gossel, Peter B. Schmidt, Gossel. There are many more stories and examples of the followers of biblical teachings attempting to live the witness of their convictions. World War I incidents. Local patriotic community members visited the Walter and George Cooprider farm near Inman. When the Coopriders refused to purchase the war bonds, the two were tarred and feathered. And we've already discussed about them going to the Charles Diener home and doing the same thing. And this is recorded in the McPherson Daily Republic in April of 1918. World War II. Those who oppose conflict resolution by violence are a problem to governmental leaders. The United States government created the CPS program, Civilian Public Service Program, as an alternative to military service. These CPS camps provided non-military civilian service in place of military service. Financing the CPS camps was the responsibility of the sponsoring churches. When available, the government did provide housing in former Civilian Conservation Corps facilities. People who served in CPS camps received no pay. Congregations and church organizations supported the program. Personal needs were provided by family and friends. The government did provide some housing in the form of Depression Area CCC camps. And this is a certificate of the nature that MCC gave out for people who sent donations to support CPS boys. Or women too. There were women in CPS camps. World War II. In southwest Kansas during World War II, the hatred propagated by vigilante patriots resulted in the sexual mutilation of conscientious objectors. The victims of these crimes were too humiliated to reveal the abuse to their communities. These crimes were unreported abuse, therefore impossible to document. This account of this incident was related by close friends of the victim. World War II civilian public service camps were established via the efforts of Mennonite Central Committee, American Friends Service Committee, Brethren Service Committee. CPS camps were also established by the Catholics, the Methodists, American Baptists, Disciples of Christ, and other conscientious objector organizations. The tension and stress of conscientious objection to war and violence is evident in today's society. The holidays, memorials, ceremonies, and events dedicated to the exaltation of nationalistic causes in all social groups around the world is evidence of society's trust in violence. Peace must be armed. Post-World War II slogan in Eastern Europe. Mennonite relief efforts in post-World War II Eastern Europe struggled with political distrust and political manipulation. This is a quote from Bernard Thiessen, University of Hamburg, May 20, 2023. It's about a year ago. He was here, visited here. Learning to follow Jesus' teaching, love your enemies, return evil with good. Vietnam War incident. On an evening in 1969 in Hillsborough, Kansas, 4 young men followed and cornered another 20-year-old draft-age young man who was a conscientious objector to the military war effort. They pulled him from his car and roughed him up, some accounts say beat him, and then proceeded to piss or urinate on him. The account of this incident was related by a close friend of the victim. During the 1950s and 1960s, during the Korean War and Vietnam War, the United States government selective service system incorporated a 1W classification. The selective service classification provided service opportunities in place of military service for CO draftees. In 1973, the mandatory conscription of all males in the U.S. for military service is ended. Mandatory registration for selective service continues. In Kansas, boys cannot get a driver's license if they do not register for the military draft via the selective service system. In the United States, in the 20th century, was a defining experience for conscientious objectors. Young men born after 1955, those who are now under the age of 68 or 69, are not classified in the selective service as conscientious objectors. In most European countries and also in the Soviet Union, Russia, provisions for alternative service were allowed. In many instances, hardships, harassment, isolation were encountered. We celebrated 100 years. A relief sale, a men's course, a museum, a world conference, a postage stamp, and a Liberty Bell, which hung for 2 years at the Smithsonian. The 21st century, our mission remains the same. Take thou my hand, O Father, and lead thou me. The 21st century, its rewards, its blessings, its challenges, its stewardship, its opportunities, spiritual growth, learning to follow Jesus, living in the image of Christ. We are most abundantly blessed.
Bind us together, Lord, bind us together with cords that cannot be broken. Bind us together, Lord, bind us together, Lord, bind us together with love. There is only one God. There is only one King. There is only one
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arlin. That was powerful. I noticed you had a thing on questions up there. Are you willing to take a few?
I don't have answers, but I'll listen to the questions.
That's a good kind of a teacher. Any questions for Arlin now? Well, I'm sure that you'll all remember this. There'll be a quiz on it. But just in case you need a cheat sheet, we have one that we made up. It's a towel with the timelines on, as you saw on in your program. That also, I put a casing here so you can put a dowel rod through and easily hang it up like those calendars we used to get. So this is one format and the other is placemats. And somebody said, well, what if your eater is real sloppy? I said, you just flip it over when it's time to eat, but you can talk about it before. So, this recorded, yeah. Will it be on the,
Yeah, I think we've been trying to put it on our webpage.
we're trying to put it on our web page.
And it will be on, it was Facebook Live, so it'll be on our Facebook page for a little while.
So you can pick it up off of Facebook, on the museum Facebook page, yeah. So these programs, well, I want to tell you a little story about Arlin. When I first started doing this, when the museum decided that this 150th would be an important thing to celebrate, and I was on the committee, and I got very excited about it. And I just started listing all the things I wanted to do that were important to me. And one of them was a timeline, because I thought it would put it into some context. And the other was that I could put it on a tea towel. And so, Arlin, thank you for making my wishes come true. And it's just been fun to work with. These programs don't come without funding, and our funding is all volunteer. And there's a donation basket right in the back of the sanctuary, and these swag items are sold over here in the foyer over here. And the other thing is, in upcoming events in July, we have the dual storytelling. It's by Pauline Sharp, who is a woman from the Kaw Nation, and Annette Voth, who is a woman from, her roots were Alexanderville. She was in Tabor, and a farm woman. And so it's their dual stories, telling what they all were doing together. I saw it, they did it for the Kaw Prairie Kanza on a Zoom presentation, and it was really quite good. I enjoyed it. August 2 is the Friday of Threshing Days, and there'll be a presentation at the Gossel High School. It's another way of telling our story. It's more, it's with pictures and acting, and there'll be a little bit of everything in it. Music, I think. And then September 22 here at Alexanderville, we're going to celebrate the immigrant houses, and we're going to take a pilgrimage out to where the immigrant houses stood, and Brian Stuckey will be leading us and telling us about that. Also that day, that same afternoon, it starts at 3, there's available tours of the Alexandriville Church, which you can view the original church books from Chekhovka and from Molochna and other artifacts, and you can find out where the hidden treasures are kept in this building. There'll be not a replica, the outline of the Cimbria, so you can walk through it. You can lay down in one of the 18-inch beds and take a nap. We will put the flags out again in the Alexandriville Cemetery, so that they won't be in the other church cemeteries, but we'll put them out in Alexandriville. And I hope to have a little ship kind of restaurant with food they might have had. So don't come hungry. But it'll be reishi tuebak and maybe some barley tea and soup with maybe a leaf of cabbage in it. Maybe it'll hit yours will be the lucky bowl. So it's those sorts of things to try and really get more of a feeling for what our ancestors went through. And then, the date for the dual storytelling with Pauline Sharp and Annette Voth is July 14, and that'll be at Tabor Church. So please come and enjoy. Yes. That's a good point. I hadn't thought of that. Because you don't use a knife on them. Maybe that answers my question. Some people, when they roast sweebuck, they slice them, but I never do. You just break them. Maybe that's interesting. Okay, anything else? Yes. I don't know if I just come all the way up. What?
My name is Eldon Esau, and one of the things that has come to my attention, and I'm sure many of you are aware of it also, is the timing of when our Mennonite people came to this area and the timing of when the Indians were pushed out. And I guess my theory is that the railroad agents did not, they said it was empty land, and that I wonder how much our Mennonite ancestors were aware of what had gone on before. You mentioned very briefly some of the last incidents of U.S. military on the Indians, and this Pauline Sharp with the Kaw Nation, they moved from Medicine Lodge in 1873, and they're having a powwow there, I think 2 weeks from this weekend. Council Grove. Is it? Yeah, Council Grove. That's okay. I'm sorry, but anyway, so that's a question that is stirring in the Mennonite Church about taking this land from the Indians, from the predecessors there. They were here first, and we have a lot of history here now too.
I too felt that was an important topic, or we felt that. So that's the dual storytelling will really hit on that. Yeah.
I don't know that much much about it.
Yeah, it's a powerful side-by-side story. So,
I will say this about the reference I made to the Indian battle in Scott County. It occurred when the chiefs who were in Oklahoma were encountering some illnesses within their tribal group. And they came to the conclusion that if they stayed in Oklahoma in that setting, their people would suffer more than if they would pick up and move to Montana. And so their goal was to preserve the health of their women and children and then move to another government reservation. I mean, this is all, as I talked about, the government regulations that kept us going from Prussia to Russia. And I mean, there's all kinds of, Caesar has his regulations, and the Caesar's regulations involved the indigenous people also. So in order to help the health struggles of the tribe in Oklahoma, they wanted to go to Montana, where they felt they would have a better life. Well, when they left the reservation, they violated some of the agreements that had been made, and the troops from Fort Dodge were sent in pursuit. So they were supposed to take them back to Oklahoma. Well, they got as far as Scott City or Scott County. If you've ever been to Scott County National Park or State Park over there and have visited Squaw's Den, they put the women and children and the old men in a canyon. Yes, western Kansas has a canyon, and it has, a very rolling countryside. They put the old men and women and children in this canyon in a kind of almost like a cave in the end of it, which is known as Squaw's Den now. And then the warriors built little rock embattlements along the rim up higher to protect themselves from the Fort Dodge soldiers that came in. The warriors won the battle. They drove the soldiers back to Fort Dodge. And the indigenous people continued their trek to Montana. Now, there's another story about the last Indian raid in Kansas, and that happened in northern Kansas someplace, and I'm not quite sure exactly where that was. But it was shortly after this Indian battle in Scott County. But the whole goal of the Indian or indigenous people was to move from the Oklahoma reservation to a Montana reservation.
thanks for coming out. Thanks for supporting our 150th celebrations. It's good to see familiar faces becoming more familiar. So join us on July 14 and on August 2 and on September 22, and we will see you there. The donation basket's back there.